Well, hello and welcome to the CNBC Africa special, brought to you rather in partnership with tax and advisory firm BDO. My name is Fifi Peters, and in fact, this broadcast coming to you live from Cape Town, not too far away from where South Africa's finance minister wrapped up the main budget speech around this time yesterday. And if we are going to judge the market's response, the fact that the rand is firming and the bond market also firming slightly, it would seem that the markets have given the finance minister of South Africa a pass mark in terms of the numbers that he delivered. But of course, by the finance minister's admission, South Africa's economy is by no means out of the woods. We are still not growing fast enough to absorb the growing number of people that are entering the job market, and certainly not growing fast enough for a lot more companies to flourish in this environment so that they can contribute a whole lot more to the public purse. So, in the next hour, we are going to be bringing you the latest reactions to the budget numbers that you may have missed, but you should be knowing right now. We are going to be interrogating more closely what this budget does mean for the economy, which is in an uncertain time right now with the elections, the key elections, game-changing elections we have been told just around the corner. We are going to be getting into those tax matters that I believe that many of you in South Africa are discussing in your living rooms, and tax matters, of course, that are being discussed in major boardrooms, and ultimately looking at the investment implications. I'm not alone. As you can see, I do have some very familiar faces on stage with me. Many of you would be familiar with them, but for those of you who are not, I'm going to introduce them to you, beginning with the gentleman on my immediate right, of course, the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service of this country, Commissioner Edward Kishweta. Also being joined by Ms. Busisiwe Mabuso, the Chief Executive Officer of Business Leadership South Africa. I do have on stage with me also Mr. David Varnica, who is the adjacent associate professor and the head of income tax technical over at BDO, and joining us online, Ms. Annabelle Bishop, who is the chief economist over at Investec Limited. Do join the conversation with us and with the audience members, of course, who are joining us here from Cape Town. If you want to participate, feel free to use some of the hashtags BDO budget speech, and also budget 2024. With that said, getting straight into the conversation, beginning with the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service. Sir, thanks so much for your time. So I have the pleasure, of course, of being on your mailing list. And your team released an immediate reaction to the budget. And you said in the statement, of course, that SARS is very much committed to supporting fiscal consolidation of this government through improved tax administration, notwithstanding the fact that the economy is not growing fast enough, that unemployment is continuing to tick higher, and of course that we have seen company profits lower this time around, probably not making your job easier. But just talk to us in terms of practical steps of what your commitment to this government in terms of improved tax administration practically looks like, sir.
Thanks, Fifi, and good evening. I'm always surprised. South Africa must be the only country in the world where the tax commissioner gets a standing ovation. It says something about our challenging past that we come from. When people meet me in the supermarkets, they want to touch me to say, "Are you real?" Because I think sometimes one might appear as a computer-generated image. So I am real. Well, first of all, I think what does the minister mean by fiscal consolidation? It is to ensure that our debt, which is already scary, and we're spending 20 cents out of every rand that SARS collects, we're spending it just to service the debt. I mean, if you think about that as a number, over 5 years, that's our entire 1 year's collection, just to service the debt. And so I think what is important when we make the point that an effective tax administration is the most sustainable factor towards fiscal sustainability and integrity, is arguing that the tax revenue, that the theoretical tax revenue, which is a function of what happens in the economy and the administration of the tax laws, is really the cheapest form of revenue for any country. And the fact that we are not collecting all the taxes that are due, notwithstanding the fact that you're on our mailing list, so we don't.
Are you implying something?
Many people on our mailing list just ignore us. So we need to be efficient in, first of all, identifying them and in knocking on their doors, changing the color of the letters, the tone of our voice, and sometimes asking for the help of the courts. Because, let me share with you a number. The debt book of taxpayers who owe money to SARS, of debt that is not in dispute, is 300 billion rand. It's not an insignificant amount of money. Imagine if we could collect that. We would not have to take the 150 billion rand from the Reserve Bank reserves, because we could adequately fund the expenditure of government. And so just to give you an idea, just this year to date, to deal with that debt book, and we can't keep up because we just don't have the resources, but just to deal with that debt book, we have had to work through over 2 million cases, taxpayers. And as I said, from a friendly letter through to a threat of a court civil judgment or freezing their assets, we have had to resolve over 2 million cases this year. And just that effort has meant that in the number the minister announced as revenue collected is an amount of 70 billion that would not have been there had we not done our work.
Sure. Another
piece of work, and then I'll pause there, is sadly taxpayers, either out of desperation or just blatant dishonesty or criminality, have found the revenue system as a target that they attack to see if they can get money from SARS. So it's either by misstating their expenses or their income, or by creating fake entities, registering it for VAT so that they can get input VAT claims with no intention to trade afterwards. We receive year to date 14 million tax returns. We cannot humanly possible work through that and assess everyone manually. So we have developed a deep set of data science using machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence to go through each one of those returns. This year to date, 1.5 million of those returns have been flagged as a risk to us. We then give that to about 600 people who have to work through each one, contact the taxpayer, get additional information, arrive at an assessment outcome, which invariably will be more taxes or refunds are stopped. Just that piece of work this year will have year to date already kept the outflow of 67 billion rand of refunds.
Sure.
So if you add the 70 billion to the 67 billion to the 17 billion of just general compliance to the 14 billion of crime that we prevent, you end up with an amount of 210 billion that's in the numbers. And so when we say a well-functioning tax authority is the most sustainable route to fiscal integrity and fiscal sustainability, that's what we mean.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And by the way, congratulations on your reappointment.
Yeah. We'll have another conversation.
Okay. I feel like we've broken a bit of news there, but this is not why we're here. Busi, again, I'm very fortunate to be on your mailing list, but I also follow you on Twitter. And I was very surprised at your reaction to the budget. We do know you as a lady who's very frank and tells it like it is. And so I was perhaps expecting just a little bit more heat and fire directed towards the finance minister. And yet this wasn't the case from Business Leadership South Africa. You described this as a solid budget, even in an election year. Kindly expand on what you meant on that.
And in all honesty, it was. I think the minister did a brilliant job, in maintaining fiscal consolidation, in maintaining fiscal discipline. He really delivered a stronger fiscal discipline than what most of us would have thought he was going to be able to achieve. He didn't go overboard in terms of committing government to expenditure that we don't have. So the level of spending was just at the right level, which was a brilliant job on his part, especially because of the weak economic outlook that we have as a country. And I think it was very positive because the business community, the investor community, the international community needs the reassurance that we are going to stay on the path of fiscal discipline and fiscal consolidation so that we can deal with the debt levels that we actually have as a country. And as I said, especially given the pressure that he has got, from a whole lot of his colleagues, pushing him to spend more. This is an election year, and I think that comes with its own challenges, but he really restrained himself and made sure that he put South Africa first, and I think kudos for him and his National Treasury team in as far as that is concerned. He was also very pragmatic. He highlighted the fact that our economic growth is going to remain subdued. We saw the unemployment numbers come out on Tuesday. You're still sitting in a country where you've got more unemployed people than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape. It is a cause for concern, and I think David and I were just talking about the tax base, and I think I saw a number somewhere, 5 million, 5.5 million. The commissioner would know best, and you only have about 10% of that number, David, that is responsible for more than 50% of the payers you earn that the commissioner collects. It's a very worrying picture, as it were. It says that something is going to have to give in as far as changing our economic trajectory, and it's actually going to have to give soon, and I really think that he adopted a very pragmatic and realistic approach in solving for the problems that we have from a fiscal perspective. And he did that while maintaining a credible economic path, to make sure that we can get out of this problem as a country. And as much as he tried to restrain himself in as far as the populist measures are concerned, I'm not very happy about the 1.4 billion to the NHI. I don't know why we are going there as a country. That thing is never going to work. The system that government wants to implement in as far as the NHI is concerned is this. It's not done like this anywhere else in the world. I don't know why we would want to put our health system on a monopoly when monopolies are failing everywhere else in this country. We are actually changing. We are actually changing into PPP models, which is why we are liberalizing the generation space, which is why we are actually, according to the roadmap of transport and logistics, trying to bring in the private sector. That is what is currently working. And to think that you can put money on the dismal, dysfunctional public healthcare system and think that money is going to solve it, it really doesn't make sense. The 1.4 billion could have gone elsewhere. We are under serious fiscal pressures in this country. Those hospitals need walls painted, they need beds, they need equipment, they need all of those things, but I guess that is yet another discussion. But it did a brilliant job. Overall,
notwithstanding.
Absolutely brilliant job, notwithstanding.
And you see, so that element, it forms part of the assessment of some people is to say whether there were some nuances that tilt towards supporting the election environment in this budget. By his own admission, the minister has said that this is not an election budget, but one has to wonder when you have allocations such as that, when you also have personal income taxes that didn't change. I mean, we were obviously absolutely grateful for that, and the fact that the fuel levy and the general the road accident fund levy also didn't change. But one has to wonder to what degree, if we weren't in an election year, notwithstanding the cost of living crisis that we are in, whether that would have looked different. But David, perhaps your intake here and your assessment of the budget for the tax landscape, ultimately what it means.
Yes, hi Fifi, and good to be here. Good evening all. Yeah, so I think I do agree that I think it was a good, solid budget in very difficult circumstances. I think one can obviously debate the use of the contingency reserve account, which is probably the biggest ticket item in the whole budget. But looking at the income tax side, I think if you start with the premise, and as was announced at medium-term budget last year, that there was going to be 15 billion of tax extracted from the system. So if you start with that and you look at the ways in which that could have been done, I think we all sort of expected what eventually happened. Some people thought that there'd be an increase partly in the fuel levy combined with bracket creep. I think most people thought there'd be bracket creep, maybe not totally in the way that it happened. That was always going to be problematic, I think, especially in an election year. I think for that reason, probably fuel levies are also seen as regressive and similar to that in a way. So probably one can understand that. But I do have a slight question mark about, if you take the context that it was a 1.8 trillion rand budget, right? Is 18 billion that significant that there actually had to be that amount extracted from the tax base? I just question, because households are under pressure. The personal income tax burden in this country is one of the highest in the world. And in the 2021 budget, that was already stated that it was one of the highest amongst the middle income countries in the world. This has made it worse. It's made that burden worse. So I just wonder if, whether it was actually necessary to extract that tax at all. And in other words, we could have had a full inflationary concession with regard to the bans.
Okay.
But I think overall, I do agree, very difficult budget.
Okay.
And, not too bad. And it could have been worse, certainly.
Okay. You don't have to wonder. Just ask the commissioner. Was it necessary?
Look, I think we always speak from our narrow interest.
Okay.
And there are some realities that's incontrovertible in the South African landscape, and there are many poor people who are unemployed. And think of it what you want. Without the social wage composite that government gives them, they would be destitute. And then we're going to fight over why do we have social insurrection and unrests. And so that's the big threat. I think where I support the notion that this is not just a knee-jerk reaction to election year is if the minister wanted to do that, he could have introduced a wealth tax. Because that's a clear message that you are going to extract more money from the wealthy. Whereas the income tax, not allowing it for fiscal drag, spreads it across the entire tax base, rather than just focusing it on a narrow interest. He could have reviewed the level of corporate income tax, but he didn't. So I think it's a bit unfair if you want to coin the budget in any way, you have to say it continues to take care of the poor. And that's, none of us can argue that that's electioneering or that's, because it's a consistent trend. 60% of our expenditure is consumption-based. Within that, a significant amount is the provision of goods and services for poor people. The real issue is, as the commentators have said, we are not growing the economy. And until we grow the economy, no amount of balancing on either side of the fiscal framework, expenditure, revenue, is going to really deal with the longer-term challenge of fiscal consolidation. And I think that's where the real challenge is. So what I would always encourage taxpayers and voters to do is to start focusing on the quality of expenditure and ensure they use their say through the democratic processes and through civil and other organizations to demand more for their money.
Sure.
But I think generally the minister was measured in his approach to raising additional taxes, and he was not populist. He could have taken other measures, but we know within Treasury, within SARS, within the family, we've always consistently said that we've reached a point of inflection where if you become too zealous about extracting more taxes, then you inadvertently hurt the system in the long term and you have a compliance deficit, which is money off the table. And the minister also buys into our doctrine that whilst there is still a compliance dividend to be had, it is better to focus on a more efficient administration effort to extract more money than to fiddle with the tax rates.
Okay, I think those are really solid arguments there that you have presented. The other side of the story, just in terms of it not being an election budget, supporting what the minister has said. Of course, everyone in this room is entitled to their own opinion, but at least it's a holistic one, just given the fact that there's been quite a few arguments weighed there. Let's hear from Annabelle right now. And Annabelle, I'm hoping that you're going to steer the conversation into growing the economy. I mean, ultimately, we have heard that this economy is by no way doing what it needs to do to grow the pie that the finance minister did make reference of yesterday. You also mentioned the fact that this was a stronger budget than you had expected. And perhaps if you can just expand on that in terms of what your expectations were and how they were perhaps met and exceeded in some ways. But more importantly, I would like to understand from you in terms of your first take as to whether this is a budget that gets the economy to start to grow again.
Yes, hi, Fifi. Look, I think, the point about the budget really is that it's not actually up to the finance ministry or even National Treasury to get the economy to grow or indeed to actually even push through growth reforms. And of course, really the purpose of National Treasury, the finance ministry, is to collect the taxes via SARS, obviously, and to disburse the monies into different expenditure items. And often these expenditures are actually hard baked in. It's difficult to change them quickly and easily. So, what we're really finding is that we're in a situation where current expenditure has grown very rapidly in South Africa. And of course, that is expenditure on civil servant salaries and wages, as we know, but also, of course, on the social wage, the social grants, whether it's education, healthcare provision, etc. So, these are the areas which has made South Africa's budget and continues to see it from the government perspective, voted in by Parliament as socially responsible, socially supportive. It doesn't actually see a similar level of support to economic growth initiatives. It doesn't mean that monies are not set aside for infrastructure investment. Of course they are, but not necessarily to the same degree. And what is actually the problem here? Well, particularly, we have very high debt servicing costs, borrowing costs in South Africa, but to the extent that it actually crowds out other forms of expenditure. Just by way of an example, if we look at the budget deficit, which is close to 5% of GDP, perhaps 4.7 last year, moving to 4.9 this year, really if we look at what is the budget deficit, it is expenditure and, of course, taxes. So, tax less expenditure. But when we take out cost of servicing debt, then you get the primary balance. So that obviously is taxes, less expenditure without servicing debt. That means that it actually falls to zero. So you've got about 5% of GDP, which you're actually spending on servicing debt. Now that money in an economy which is, around about 5 to 6 trillion could be much better spent in other areas. And that's what's often referred to as crowding out government expenditure, which could be used more for infrastructure, for the economic growth initiatives. And of course, that's where, there can be an influence. But of course, you do continue to have these pressures come onto government in terms of expenditure. Looking at the budget itself, we said there was better than expected. Markets were expecting a worse outcome. And of course, as a consequence of that, we have seen a bit of strength in the rand and bond markets. Of course, overnight the rand did weaken, and that's because the FOMC minutes came out, and that really showed the United States is not in any rush to start cutting interest rates. Cutting interest rates, of course, would see some rand strength on the back of dollar weakness. But really, we did expect that there would be some utilization of the GFICRA account. For those wanting to know what the acronym recently spoken about is the Gold and Foreign Exchange Contingency Reserve account from the South African Reserve Bank. Why it matters is the monies actually belong to National Treasury. And of course, that 500 billion is helpful in terms of reducing debt. We saw 150 billion do just that in the planned medium-term expenditure framework. And of course, it is a more appropriate utilization of the monies. For government to increase borrowings, it has these high debt costs of above 10% in terms of its yields, the bond yields, the interest payments it needs to make, whereas the GFICRA account obviously is interest-free. So transferring that money from SARB to the National Treasury is very normal. It happens around the world. It's a normal process and is something actually quite positive in an environment where we've seen political parties eye nationalization of the Reserve Bank to get hold of these assets. Because bear in mind, this GFICRA account is over 90% of the South African Reserve Bank's assets. So by actually using the money more effectively to reduce debt, for example, instead of it sitting idle and earning no interest, and starting to remove it from perhaps what we would see in a coalition government later this year, where other parties get increased votes in Parliament and governments, the ANC's ones decrease, then obviously there is some threat around that potentially. So, all in all, we don't think it was a bad move. And of course, this obviously has been positively received by markets, as you mentioned.
Okay, and thanks actually for raising that acronym, the GFICRA acronym that we all need to get acquainted with. I mean, there's worse acronyms out there, I can tell you, the twisted tongue. This one is not so bad. David, you questioned the timing of GFICRA, and perhaps I'd like to understand what you meant by that. You were wondering why now. Yes, we know that conversations have been taking place behind closed doors. In fact, I was told, and so you can correct me if I'm wrong, I was told conversations started in the first half of last year already around GFICRA. But what concerns do you have around the timing of tapping into that reserve account now?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's basically a rainy day fund, and we're tapping into it now. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have tapped into it, but
the rain's pouring.
Yeah. But once we start using it, we don't then have those reserves anymore. So we must just then remember that we're in this sort of predicament we're in now because of policy decisions and the lack of growth and so on. It's been driven by various factors, but it's basically largely of our own making. So we're taking from our sort of family war chest now to plug those gaps. We need to fix the underlying problems that got us here in the first place so that they don't recur, because otherwise we're going to be back in the same position with fewer reserves in the future. So it's not so much that we shouldn't be using it now. It's just unfortunate, I suppose, that we're in this position that we've had to use it now. But I mean, look, it is going to play a major part in helping to reduce our interest payments, which is obviously what we need.
Sure, which is the positive response I think that the market and perhaps the business community has given to it, the fact that it is going to lessen the burden a bit on debt services costs. Whereas there are others who believe that perhaps what we're doing with it is kicking the can further down the road. And I suppose it speaks to your argument as to whether we're really fixing the problems in the manner that we should be fixing them right now. Busi, your take on GFICRA?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think I'm with David on this one. I don't think we should have gone there as a country, but we've got our backs against the wall and we needed to get the money from somewhere. So we actually had to go to the contingency reserve account, as it were, because what the function of this account is to really protect the country from international crises and to maintain credibility of our international financial system. It is not meant as a free pot for government bailouts. And I worry that once we've dipped our hand in it, are there going to be strict conditions that are going to be put in place in terms of what we utilize it for, and the fact that it can be this pot of money that we resort to whenever we find ourselves in a fix, as it were. And I think that is the huge concern for me as far as this is concerned. We're going to have to make sure as well that we still remain with enough buffers, for the currency swings, and that we're protected in as far as that is concerned. And independence, not only the independence, the solvency of the Reserve Bank is not going to be compromised in the process. I mean, we've had a lot of conversations before in the country around the independence of the Reserve Bank. So as soon as you dip, into this money, you wonder if I'm probably connecting two things that don't need to be connected, but we are utilizing it for something that we shouldn't be utilizing it for.
Sure.
That's not what it's there for.
Sure. Commissioner, I imagine that you were part of conversations regarding Jafikra.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are no free choices. Every choice has a cost, and this has the lowest cost. When is a good time to use your reserves? I mean, think about your own family budgets. If you're sitting with some money or some assets that you could liquidate to, rather than borrowing money that's more expensive, why would you not use it? I mean, there's some other radical arguments that says, why didn't we use it sooner? Because that would have kicked in a lower debt service cost sooner. Why aren't we more aggressive than only... and I think it's a measured approach where actually in setting or in drawing down on the 150, the arrangement is also to set aside 100 billion that will ensure that the liquidity risk on the Reserve Bank is protected. If you take a bet, the value that we have there is because of the weakening of the rand against the dollar, which, on the one hand is bad news if you have overseas holidays and you have to spend in dollars.
Sure.
But it's good news if you're building reserves within your local and domestic economy. And so we're simply turning what would otherwise be negative news into a good purpose. So there would never be a good or a bad time. I think where I really compliment the minister is 2 years ago when SARS produced 189 billion, more than what we expected. He took about a third of that, and he did exactly the same. He paid off expensive debt. And so what he's doing now, he's saying, is I'm going to use that over the next 3 years to lower the debt service cost so that you get out of this vicious cycle and slowly begin to have a virtuous cycle. So I think I accept that there's always positions, whether it's informed by our own economic theory or ideological perspective. I think it's hard to argue that this wasn't a good way to maintain the path of fiscal consolidation. I certainly support it.
I mean, I get it in terms of it helping us out right now while the rain is pouring, a short-term measure, and hopefully not something that we do tap into continuously, but you can understand the apprehension of that being the case, and especially just given the fact that, when you do tap into the rainy day fund, it's with the understanding and the plan of knowing where more money is going to come from in future, so more secured cash flow in future. And I think that that's the question mark that we do have of South Africa's economy right now, just given its predicament. And Annabelle, I know that you did mention the fact that, the budget, it wasn't necessarily about growing the economy per se, but it is important for it to have provided the framework in which the private sector can feel free to participate in a lot more in doing its work to help grow the economy and, more importantly, create jobs. And I'd just like your perception and reflections thereof on that framework, and whether you do think that this is a framework in which more corporates bite and jump into the South African party.
So I think, we really look back at where we are and obviously why we have seen such deterioration in government finances over the past decade and more. And of course, one factor has been the deterioration in tax revenues. Now, of course, what that really means is that government has not seen as much tax collection as it should have done. This impacts negatively on government finances because both of the weak economic growth environment, that means you collect less taxes than you would in a stronger economic growth environment, but also, of course, as well, you find yourself in a situation when you get commodity price swings, as we obviously did last year, that you then find you also are impacted as as a commodity exporter. And of course, that's what South Africa is. So, if we look at the budget itself, it does pull back from the fiscal slippage that was detailed in the medium-term budget policy statement in November last year. And of course, that is more positive for markets, for investors as well in South Africa's government bonds. The bulk of South African government bonds are actually held by South African institutions. So, of course, that is very important for the sustainability of the South African economy. And, of course, longer-term borrowing costs as well, which are influenced by South Africa's government bonds. All of those factors also feed through into the property market and have an impact there as well. But if we obviously have a look at the growth initiatives and, of course, economic growth itself in South Africa, we know it's obviously been held back very heavily by load shedding and, of course, by Transnet's rail and freight incapacity. Looking at these areas, we didn't see any bailouts. We did see an extension of debt guarantee for Transnet, which is about 45 billion. But overall, we really found ourselves in a situation where obviously there are these risks still to the economic growth outlook. Weak economic growth outlook, and one which is obviously not expected to make inroads either in unemployment or in repairing South Africa's tax revenue. And that really is the big issue. South Africa needs to move to a strong economic growth environment of about 3%, preferably more towards the 5% mark, to actually be able to support its expenditure and to support the social wage, certainly, but to have more monies to set aside for expenditure on growth initiatives and, of course, as well, to obviously reduce government finances where this debt escalation that we've seen and bring us back to sustainable levels.
Sure.
In the 2000s, we had a debt ratio of closer to 20%, and we actually had an A-grade credit rating, which people forget. And, of course, now we are at the BB- mark, and we have seen debt escalate towards the 80% mark of the projections, but luckily pulled back by the judicious use of the GEF account. But really, I think to answer your question, the repair of Eskom, for example, is not the responsibility of National Treasury. All it can actually do is put conditions in place in terms of allowing it to access the debt relief, which actually stops it from borrowing more. And, of course, the actual growth policy for the energy sector comes through from the IRP 2023, which comes through from the mining sector. And obviously crowding in more renewable energy, for example, is very positive for a growth outlook. And as reducing load shedding and, of course, the freight and rail capacity to actually give the business sector more confidence and obviously stimulate more economic growth.
All right. Okay. Thanks so much for that, Annabelle. We're going to open up to the audience members right now for your questions. I just have one more brief one for the Commissioner. So the wealth tax, is that still on the table?
Government has to keep all options on the table. You can't ever say that there's not going to be a review of any of the taxes. But I think the general message that the last two ministers of finance, Tito Mboweni as well as Enoch Godongwana, has said is their approach is to lower our taxes towards OECD norms, but the quid pro quo for that is a more compliant tax base. You've got to look at broadening measures, more inclusive measures. And if you think about the global minimum tax, for example, where there's wholesale abuse by multinationals of base erosion and transfer pricing profit shifting practices, including South African companies, that does not underlie a strong commercial or economic sense. And so the global minimum tax, for example, will go a long way to protecting our base. And no matter how you then arrange your fares or aggressive planning, you will pay a minimum of 15% tax, which I think is solid. It also means that we will, where companies are economically present in South Africa, even though they are not physically present, the traditional nexus of taxing rights, we will get a proportional share of global companies' profits who are domiciled elsewhere, but who actually benefit from their profits from being in South Africa. So I think about 30 countries, OECD countries, have already signed up. We expect that will increase. And I think it continues to say that the preferred choice of government is not to do the populist things of fiddling with taxes, but to broaden the tax base, make it more inclusive. And all that is expected of those who must pay their fair share.
Sure.
And I think that has been a consistent trend by this administration.
Okay. Question time, right? Yeah, and I'm going to ask the CEO of BDO to lead us in the question time, Mr. Bonga Mokwena, sir. If you can let us know your thoughts, particularly, I suppose, representing your organization and your clients all over the world.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. This is a wonderful platform for us to just share some ideas and collaboratively think about how do we move forward as a country. In BDO, we are about elevating people, elevating business, and elevating society. The Minister of Finance needs to be congratulated for setting the country on a very strong path and a sure path towards fiscal consolidation. Because number one, I think the message that's coming out of the budget that has been delivered yesterday is sensitive to the conditions and the situation of the poor, the unemployed. That's number one. Number two, it's also been sensitive to the expectations of the business, the investors, local and foreign direct investment, because it's about the sentiment. It's conveyed certainly a very, very strong message that we are surely on a very, disciplined fiscal path. And last but not least, I think it's dealt with a very, very, critical issues from a balance perspective that, really make sure that this budget, it takes us to a space where we can begin to work on a foundation that is sure to reduce the debt. And I think overall it's been a very, very well done balancing act. And I think my view, and I think which is the view, will be the view of a number of stakeholders across the spectrum, will be that post the elections, this path that has been started be maintained. And therein lies the biggest challenge, based on where we are economically, based on the outlook, which is very subdued. We would not sustainably put our economy on a growth path unless we maintain the fiscal, discipline. That's just some of my views.
I hope so, because as a journalist, after the minister did deliver his budget speech, there were several political party leaders who were also outside the City Hall, and they had some real interesting things to say about the budget. And therefore, I do hope it is a situation that you are talking about, whereby we do have this continuity post-May 29th. Because if we don't, yeah. Questions, if maybe by a show of hands. Okay, I've got a lady here in the front. I've got another gentleman here. Okay, I see your question, sir, and I see yours as well. We'll come to you next. Maybe just stand. You're on TV. Let's do this.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Peli Sankoma. I'm a development economist. I share different views around the fiscal consolidation, and I'll tell you why. We allocate 17 rand per child on early childhood development. To date, the census shows that even though we spend so much money on education, we've not been able to draw social dividends on the amounts that we actually invest in education. I'm just picking up education as an issue because there's a correlation between the quality of education and the current growth crisis that we're confronted with. And therefore, fiscal consolidation for me becomes a concern in that what it actually does is that it casts whole sorts of sets, it introduces budget cuts, but also it means that sectors who fundamentally require more support are actually going to struggle even a lot more. I think the second issue for me, I'm quite interested to hear from the panelists, is the fact that last year we had a windfall from minerals commodity prices of 140,000. We contributed towards, we paid the debt, and we're doing exactly the same thing. But you know that between that 140 billion windfall and to date, we had about 3.3% of youth unemployment increase. So that's my key question is, do you think that the best approach is to always focusing on the debt, but instead of reinvesting the money in productive resources of the economy, so that you activate the economy, both the private sector, but also, in fact, both the supply side of the economy and the demand side of the economy, so that you can increase the tax base that, Commissioner, you actually require. Thank you.
You going to ask the same question?
No, I just want to know if they're going to respond first to the lady and then another question.
Do you want to respond?
I can respond.
All right.
I'm in violent agreement with you.
Me too.
So there's no question that the quality of our spend is undesirable. In fact, per capita, I think South Africa must be one of the highest per capita expenditure on education. Yeah. But the problem starts with us thinking that a matric pass is victory. And I am personally disturbed by the fact that we call matric success rate as a measure of the investment of 12 years of education, when in fact most matriculants are unemployable. And scarier, they are irrelevant to the future world of work. So, and that's what I mean when I say we should be pounding more on the quality of the expenditure, because that's where we're losing the plot, and we will continue to lose the plot. If you think about the 500 billion rand of hard-earned South African tax money that has gone to bail out state-owned enterprises, particularly the two state-owned enterprises, they should be paying government a dividend. They should be adding to the domestic resource mobilization efforts of South Africa. But they are a drain on our economy. And last year I said some stuff on this panel that should have got me fired. I'm still here. So let me try again. Unless we fix the fundamentals of appointing leadership in positions that are competent, not because they are a particular political alignment or ideological, that's not enough to run Eskom or to run Transnet. These are complex operations that require competent managers. Secondly, to appoint professional boards and then get out of the way if you're the shareholder. You can't manage the board if you're the shareholders. The shareholders' right is to appoint the board and then let them. You can't buy a dog and then do your own barking. Right? Then don't get the dog. So unless we begin to fix these fundamental issues, state-owned enterprises will not come right. Education will not come right if we declare victory as a matric success pass. And I would bias, if I was the person allocating money, and I'm not, I would bias the expenditure towards early childhood development and early primary school, because that's when you lay the foundation for future life. We all know that if you lost a child by 6 years old, you'll never catch up. Yep. And so I am completely with you. Let's see if I get fired now.
I've never seen...
Fifi, can I just add something as far as the unemployment is
Sure.
concerned? Apologies, sir. I think from an unemployment perspective, I absolutely agree that we should be doing more in terms of spending on productive assets, but I think that's not the full story. While our environment continues to be plagued by so many challenges. You know, if you listen to the annual results presentations of a whole lot of companies last year, they were talking about how South Africa's trading environment is the most difficult that they've ever seen. I remember Remgro's, annual results presentation saying that in the 85 years of our operation, 2023 was by far the most difficult. So I really think that if we're trying to deal with the unemployment, fiscal consolidation cannot do the entire job. It's really about setting the right policies, which is why the reform agenda that we're on is very critical. The right policies which will increase investor confidence that will bring in investment that will make the economy to grow at the right levels, and only when the economy grows at the right levels. Not this 0.6% economic growth. Our population is growing at 1.6%. We are eroding from an economic perspective precisely because we're not growing at the right level. But you can't grow at the right level because the environment is not conducive. You sit without electricity for 10 hours. You've got 10 hours. You've got a Transnet that is dysfunctional. You can't get goods out of market. You can't get goods inside, South Africa. The water infrastructure is a mess depending on where you're sitting in South Africa. So we need to fix the basics if we want to deal with unemployment. I don't think fiscal consolidation is a problem that contributes to that.
Sure.
Sorry, just one thing, if I could also just add. I think the other point is it's very important for the private sector to be much more of a player in the economy as a whole than it is at the moment. There is a lot of crowding out of private sector investment. I think it's not up. We can't rely on the government to get growth going and fix everything. But there's got to be the willingness to open up the economy more to the private sector. And I was quite encouraged by some of the developments in the budget yesterday, around the infrastructure support agency that's going to be set up, with the view to actually bringing the private sector on board. I think that's quite an important development.
Okay.
My name is Malcolm, ex-BDO and an independent service provider. The knowledge that the panel has, I can't come close to that, and to many of you in the audience. So if I come across as naive, please forgive me. So I'm going to direct questions to various people, and if you'll just think about it and answer as you see fit. Edward, you said there were 300 billion owed to SARS. Who owes it?
Government ministers. Joking, I'm joking.
Edward can answer.
No, I'm not joking.
Spicy.
Also, you talk about a set tax base that you need to be more diligent in managing. Why not have that base increased? Why are we not allowing the economy to grow? If you just took your 10% of taxpayers, or 55 million that's paying, and took that up to 10 million people that pay, wouldn't that solve a lot of your problems? The other thing, as an accountant and a tax practitioner, we do all the SARS work. You have AI in the background, and then you have us. And the cooperation that we get from SARS, there are a few jewels in your department, and I take my hat off them and I value them. But on the majority, there's not a lot of assistance. Are you as diligent, and sorry to mention the government officials, are you as diligent in tracing up the corrupt government officials that have stolen the wealth of our children and our grandchildren, as you are with the retired pensioner that's now been lumped with admin penalties at $250 a month and just continues to accumulate? Whoever thought of that idea, can they please fire them? I hope it wasn't you.
Let me start with the last one and give you the absolute assurance that we do not differentiate whether you are a worker or the president of this country. We administer our law without fear, favor, or prejudice. And so whether you owe us 100 Rand or 1,000,000 Rand, we will collect that. So if you know of anyone that we're not going after, we would be happy to receive that intelligence from you. As far as so this year to date, our register has grown by about 4.5%, and that work alone, which is outreach work by us plus employers who register new taxes, and new employees and businesses who register for us, that work has added about 4.5 billion Rand of additional revenue to the fiscus. So that's an ongoing work. We use artificial intelligence to detect whether people are economically active but not registered for tax, and we find that all over the show. We find people who have financial assets abroad through the automatic exchange of information with about 100 countries around the world. We will find you if you have a bank account in another country. And it's just a matter of time, and through improving our data science and AI work, we will find the missing needle in the haystack. So there's a lot of work. Let me just, in defense of the 12,500 people, say that most of them are diligent and hard work. And I agree with you, sometimes we do have our own who drop the ball, and I would happily have those pointed out to me, because we do not tolerate it. I'm very clear that unprofessional and unethical behavior on our part by any of our employees or colluding with taxpayers is a dismissible offense. The admin penalty is an issue that we're struggling with. Let me just be clear about that. It is a real thing, but it is just stupid to ask a granny who retired 10 years ago, who lives in Saldanha Bay, to travel to our PAL office to come and tell us she doesn't work. So sometimes we're not as smart as we want to be.
All right, so with just 5 minutes left, can I just ask that the last 2 questions that we take, can you just ask one question between y'all?
And there are 2 panelists. So.
And
Annabelle.
And Annabelle, whom will get some remarks, some closing remarks from in just a short while.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I've already targeted my people that I'd like to answer the question. First and foremost, I'm KK Diaz. I'm the CEO of A-Game Business. I'm a business strategist, and we've worked with over 2,000 SMEs. And my question relates specifically to that, which is, I'm wondering why South Africa, collectively, why we're not utilizing this amazing tool, tactic called enterprise and supply development, which is the support and integration of small businesses into the supply chain of corporates. And here's my motivation. Number one, it speaks to increasing participation of non-participating South Africans into the economy. It speaks to job creation. It speaks to increasing the paying or revenue base that the Revenue Office is looking for. My brother from BDO spoke about the dignity of South Africans. It addresses so many boxes, and however, there isn't enough participation in as far as that's concerned. I don't know if there isn't enough incentives or disincentives. As far as we're concerned, there's plenty of those. My question is, BLSA, the Revenue Office, why do we not have enough corporate SA participants participating, and championing enterprise and supply development? I mean, if we're looking for champions, look no further. But the question is, why are we not riding this vehicle until the wheels come off? Because by then we'll be able to afford new wheels and ride it into the sunset. Thank you.
Okay. Busi, maybe you want to take that one?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with KK when it comes to that one. I think enterprise and supply development is being used as a tick box exercise. I think a whole lot of those BBB elements by us as the private sector, we are just not using it right. You know, it's really just compliance. You know, I think the biggest irritation for me when it comes to that enterprise and supply development is the training that we give to these SMMEs, perpetual training without graduation, training that is actually misaligned. It's misaligned because there isn't an effort by us as the private sector to say where are the gaps in our supply chain. Where do we want these SMMEs to plug in? How do we therefore make sure that we give them training that will benefit them so that we can actually put them in our supply chain distribution list and make sure that we can actually procure from them? So that is a fundamental flaw and a negative, you know, from the private sector, definitely. You know, Malcolm earlier said that he's the BDO partner, ex-BDO partner, tax specialist, chartered accountant. I swear to you, if you had to go to a company and benefit from the training, they'll take him and someone who has a standard 2 and someone who has never seen a DOF school and put them in the same training and give them business cards and say that is enterprise and supply development. That is how we are actually engaging with it, you know, which is completely wrong. So more can be done because those are billions of rands, you know, actually when you look at the fact that it's 3% of NPAT, so we could be utilizing that better. So I can normally wiggle myself out of situations, but not this one. Okay. Yeah, this one is, yeah.
The other issue, which is it's a disease in South Africa, is that the procurement value chain of government is riddled with corruption. we are on industrial scale corruption. If you take Eskom, if you take Transnet, that entire procurement value chain, we pay excessively for goods and services in government because some tenderpreneur or some fake front of a company is adding no value but is extracting a benefit for themselves. So unless the entire criminal justice system has to focus on dealing with whole-scale, industrial-scale corruption in South Africa, particularly the abuse of the government procurement. If we don't address that, you will be crowded out if you're a small, honest player just trying to eke out a living. I'll give you an example that...
Commissioner, I'm going to have to crowd you out right now, sir.
I'm humbly
I've
crowded
got my
out.
director, I'm about to be fired, and unlike you, I'm not as enthusiastic to join the unemployment line. But we'll continue the discussion just as soon as we wrap up the live broadcast, of course. But I cannot wrap this up without hearing just one last comment from Annabelle Bishop, the chief economist there over at Investec, who has been waiting patiently. Annabelle, in a tweet, if you will, your parting shot.
Hi, Fifi. Look, I think we've had a very strong, robust discussion, but it doesn't move us away from the fact that the many issues still stand out, particularly weak economic growth in South Africa and crowding in employment. As one of the people who asked a question earlier was specifically talking about, entrepreneurs are absolutely vital for the economy. What we actually need to do is see the ANC or government move a lot faster on many of its good reforms that it actually has. And I think that's the bottom line. Actually implementing them, yes, we always talk about that, but actually delivering, actually having delivery that results in having a strong productive capacity for South Africa to actually return to the economic growth rates of 3 to 5% and see our unemployment drop down and the political environment stabilize, because you do get this political unease and noise and, of course, rising populism when your economy performs so poorly.
All right. Thanks so much. We'll make that the absolute last word. Annabelle Bishop, the chief economist over at Investec, just talking about the fact that what's needed in this economy right now, less talk, a whole lot more action on plans that are credible. They are on the table already. They just need to be put to action, to work. The conversation on a growing South Africa's economy, of course, and reacting to the main budget that was presented by the finance minister is coming to an end right now, but we will continue to host such conversations on CNBC Africa and various platforms. Of course, also do follow the platforms of BDO as they continue to keep you up to date with all the things that you do need to know. But from us here in Cape Town, a warm goodbye from the Commissioner of South Africa's Revenue Service, Commissioner Edward Kishweta, as well as Busisiwe Mavuso, the Chief Executive Officer at Business Leadership South Africa, Mr. David Vanica, the Head of Income Tax Technical over at BDO, and myself. It has been a pleasure to be with you. Have a great night.